Welcome back to Black Coffee to Refill. I'm here with Symone Sanders, Senior Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden's campaign.
Yes, yes.
So one of the things you talked about was, again, being heard. One of the big stories that came out a few weeks ago was that you were the staffer who confronted the vice president about the Hyde Amendment.
I'm glad you asked me about, I'm glad you brought this up, Mark. You know, people can't always believe everything they read in the one newspaper outlet that reported it in that way.
Right.
Because frankly, I don't have to confront the vice president about anything. That is not the nature of our relationship. And also, it's very convenient that the senior advisor, who also happens to be a black woman, is the person that has to confront the former vice president.
That language is so interesting. Like,
that language
did you stop him in a hallway?
Exactly. The language was very interesting, very questionable, Mark.
Like you pulled up on him.
Exactly. Like, and that's just frankly not the nature of my relationship, but also not how I operate.
Yeah.
Like newsflash. But look, I think for folks who do have questions about the Hyde Amendment, and for people that don't know, the Hyde Amendment is an amendment actually that's currently still in place. It was passed in the United States Congress that bars federal funds from being used for abortions. So there was a senator called Senator Hyde, and he was the person that really authored and championed this amendment. And so as we were working through the details of our healthcare policy that we're about to release, a conversation about the Hyde Amendment came up. While we were having these conversations, a press inquiry about the Hyde Amendment also came up. And the press inquiry was basically, has the vice president, changed his stance on Hyde? And so as
Just to be clear, the vice president did support banning federal funds for abortion.
He had voted for the Hyde Amendment many times, as frankly had every person who's currently a member of Congress and a previous member of Congress has at one point in time voted for the Hyde Amendment.
Right.
Even folks that say they would like it to repeal. Everyone that was standing on the stage with Vice President Biden, who was a current or former member of Congress, has voted for the Hyde Amendment.
Right.
And even the people that were on the stage the first time. So again, but a lot of, we live in like a soundbite culture, and this is a lot of backstory a nuance, frankly, that you just don't get on the news. And so, yes, he had previously voted for and was in support of the Hyde Amendment, as have a number of other Democratic candidates. But the question was about Joe Biden, not anybody else.
Right.
And as we were working through the details of our healthcare policy, and under Vice President Biden's healthcare policy, it is a continued expansion of Medicaid through a public option that will reach universal care. And the question just came down to if we're saying universal care through a continued expansion of Medicaid, but also a public option, what do we do about poor and low-income women?
Right.
Because it's poor and low-income women.
And largely women of color.
And largely women of color, frankly. It's poor and low-income women, largely women of color, who are adversely affected by the Hyde Amendment. And the vice president looked at the details and was like, well, we need to cover poor and low-income women. And we were like, all right. So he was
Were you the staffer who maybe
I'm not for the Hyde Amendment?
So maybe not confront, but were you the staffer who brought that to his attention?
It was something that, again, the team had been working through, but to be clear, the vice president made his own decision. I was with him the day that, he spoke, I think this became public at the I Will Vote Gala, the DNC's I Will Vote Gala in Atlanta, Democratic National Committees, which was a fundraising event that they did at the end of like a large African-American outreach summit that they did in Atlanta, and the vice president was one of the speakers at the program. And that day, we were in the car, and we were on our way from having a round table with some leaders in Atlanta. We were on our way to the event venue, and it was the vice president himself that changed his remarks because it was something he wanted to do on his own.
Is it, for some, it's concerning that in a sea of progressive candidates, some more progressive than others for sure, that this is something that he needed to change his mind on. There's a sense that he might not be as progressive as some of the other candidates, despite his claims to the contrary, and that this would be an example of that.
I think what I would say is I think that people should, what I find refreshing, frankly, is that Joe Biden is not somebody that would just go with the political winds of what's popular. You had a lot of people, Mark, come out talking about reparations that literally did not have a plan for reparations, that had not even given a thought to reparations and what that meant. Before they got a press inquiry, but they said it because they thought it was popular, right? And then when you ask people what their plan is for reparations, well, then you get, oh, well, I believe in programs. Okay, well, under the definition that the people who are championing reparations are using, that is not their definition. And so what are you talking about? And so I think what's refreshing for me about Vice President Biden is that he's somebody that believes what he believes and is unapologetic about that. But he's also someone that's willing to listen and somebody that is candid and just frank and authentic in what he believes. And he does believe that everyone should have health care. He believes that health care is a right. And he said it himself. He said, if I believe health care is a right, I cannot support an amendment or a rule that makes that a right for people dependent upon their zip code and their income.
So why?
And I was like, oh, I agree.
So, but why, if he's so thoughtful and reads so much stuff, why did it take so long for him to come to that conclusion?
Well,
he understands the Hyde Amendment.
It's a deep personal thing for him too. You know, his faith is really important to him. He talks about, you know, how he's Catholic, and he talks about how this is something that he has struggled with throughout his career in public life. Because, you know, he personally, frankly, is against abortion, but he believes in Roe v. Wade. He believes that actually Roe v. Wade should be codified in law. He believes we have to ferociously protect a woman's right to choose, especially given this current climate where state legislatures across the country are literally trampling on the rights of women, particularly low-income and poor women, particularly women of color. So, I mean, I think it could be something difficult for some people to understand, but look, I like people that have values and have some morals and have some baseline for which they stand, which is a complete contrast to the current person in the White House, okay? Because I don't think he has any morals or any baseline from where he likes to stand. I don't know what Donald Trump believes. And it's concerning to me that he has his hands on the nuclear codes, let alone the future for my niece and nephew.
Wow. You mentioned reparations. That's another point of departures. You said that Joe Biden has not taken a stand in favor of reparations or even H.R. 40, to my knowledge.
What he said, what he has said, I think there was a Vox article that talked about this because, what was it, all my weeks went together, but 2 weeks ago, I think there were hearings on the Hill, actually, about H.R. 40, which is the bill to...
for a commission.
A commission
for reparations. And that's an important distinction.
Because people think it's a bill for reparations.
Yeah, it's a bill to have a study, to have a commission for a study.
A commission.
Right.
And we don't even know what the commission gonna do because we gotta read the bill.
Right.
Right. And so what the vice president believes is that we have to get the data to have an informed conversation about reparations. That there are a number of people having, again, like, what is the definition that we're using? What does the data say? So he believes we have to get the data. And so
the data in order to do what?
The data in order to decide. I mean, if the question on the table is, should people get reparations? I think we have to have an informed conversation, and we can't have an informed conversation without the data points. Who are the people? Are we talking about money? What kind? I think there's research that has to go behind this, and that's the vice president's stance. But what he also goes on to say is that, look, sans getting the data, there's things we can do to address the disparities between black and white people right now, and in terms of education, in terms of the economy, in terms of the justice system. Like, we don't have to wait for a study somewhere to talk to understand that the gap between black families and white families in the same socioeconomic status is more like a chasm. Okay, so that's where he is, and I mean,
I guess for some though, some would say that even without data, to know what it looks like, you could take a position of being pro-reparations just as an ideological position. Bernie Sanders has, Elizabeth Warren has.
Have they?
Yeah, I mean, Bernie's been shaky on it, to be sure, in terms of what it looks like, right? And he says my reparations looks like structural investment.
Which some people would argue is not reparations.
I would agree.
Which is why, Mark, it goes back.
But why doesn't Vice President Biden do that? Why doesn't he take a position that I support reparations?
Vice President
we just need to figure out what it looks
is
like.
That he supports getting the data to have an informed conversation about it.
Okay.
That's his position. And again, I think some people are looking for him to just go right there, but. Frankly, I would prefer, if you're not there, don't go because you think it makes me feel good.
Don't pretend to be there.
Don't pretend to be there.
That's
and
fair.
Vice President Biden isn't going to pretend to be anywhere. He's going to tell you where he's at.
He's very honest about that.
I respect that, and I think, frankly, the voters respect that. And the polls at this point tell me the voters respect that for now.
I think the reason people have skepticism, one more thing on this reparations thing, is because I know there was an interview we did in 1975.
All these 1975?
Hey, look, you can't run on experience and not be called on it, right? So in 1975, where he said, I'm not responsible for what my father or grandfather did. He said, and I damn sure won't be not willing to pay for what happened 300 years ago. That's clearly an anti-reparations position. Now, people can grow and evolve. I don't want to hold him to 1975. But I'm sure you could imagine that if you have that position in 1975, and then in 2019, 44 years later, you're saying, well, I need data to know how I feel on it, it could feel like he's skirting the issue.
Well, I don't think he's skirting it. I think he's being frank. And I'm somebody, to be frank, that's what I believe. I believe we need to have we need to have a data-based, informed conversation. Because again, many people, and this just doesn't apply to reparations, this applies to the healthcare conversation. This applies to a conversation around education. This applies to a conversation around criminal justice reform. If we are not approaching the conversation using the same definition with the same basic points of information, how are we going to get anywhere? How do we know what we're all talking about? How can we eventually all get on the same page and get something done if we're not even having the same conversation? And frankly, I believe that folks aren't even having the same reparations conversation in America right now.
That's for sure. Before you go, last week there was a debate.
Was it just last week, Mark?
I know.
It's another debate coming up at the end of this month.
Joe Biden might be, I don't know, he's still sticking from that one, maybe.
We're fine, Mark, we're fine.
How would you describe his performance in that debate?
I think our strategy going into the debate, I'm on the vice president's debate prep team, and yes, he prepped for the debate. I know there were literally, we prepped for the debate, and so any reports out there in the contrary are just, as he would say, malarkey.
Right.
And so, our strategy going into the debate was for the vice president to speak directly to the American people about his policies and what he would do as president. Because I think, frankly, a lot of folks hear a lot about Joe Biden in the news, but you're not necessarily hearing about his policies. You're hearing about, something that somebody said he did, or that people are pontificating on all of these other things, and no one's talking about his policies. And by no one, I mean the press, and not you, Mark, but some of the other people in the
I've seen it.
Which I said this in the spin room, and I pointed at people, and they were like, okay. So that was our strategy, and frankly, I think he spoke very candidly, and he talked very personally about healthcare. We had a conversation about climate change. We got in points about our education policy. We got in points about foreign policy. That is where a place where the vice president has extensive experience. I mean, then let's just go ahead and go there. We did have a somewhat of fiery exchange with Senator Harris. And I think, Senator Harris told her story. The vice president respects Senator Harris. He heard her, he listened. And I think, which is why the next day we went to, we were already going to Rainbow Push, but at the Rainbow Push Coalition Labor Luncheon.
It's good timing, though.
Reverend Jackson.
You're going to go somewhere after civil rights beef.
Strategy, okay? Campaign got good strategy.
Got a good senior advisor.
Got good strategists and a strong comms team, okay?
Yeah.
And a good political shop. But I mean, we went to Rainbow Push and we used that opportunity to speak very frankly, if you will, for where the vice president really is. Because I know there were folks saying that he was making a states' rights argument. And
it sounded like one.
I want to bat that down unequivocally, which was problematic because that's not what he believes.
But would you agree that he communicated a states rights argument?
I don't think he communicated a states' rights issue, but I don't think, as the time did, he looked at the time clock and said, oh, my time is up. I think he cut himself off before he could continue to make his point.
He said he was against the U.S. Department of Education intervening.
So I think people are conflating busing and segregation. And to be frank, Mark, I think the American people want to have a conversation about what we want to do about education now, which is why in our education plan.
No, but they care about busing too.
They care. Well, but I mean, if we really want to get down to it, I think there's a difference between de facto and de jure segregation. Okay, and de facto segregation is frankly what we have now in America. It's what we have in Omaha, Nebraska, where I'm from. It's what's happening in Philly. And de facto segregation is segregation that happens just because. Okay, so when folks move out of an urban center, community, or neighborhood, and then their neighborhood looks just like them, or when entire neighborhoods are just Latino or just Black, or so on and so forth. So that is de facto segregation. And the question is, what is the most effective remedy for de facto segregation?
Right. So for many people in the 70s, it was busing.
But you just said, we have people want to talk about busing now, and frankly, now if you talk about 2019, 2020 in terms of our education policy, I
would agree with you. Busing's probably not the way, but I don't want to lose sight of this point because this is where Kamala Harris was pushing him. In the 70s, he was very stridently against busing.
He was never against voluntary busing, though, which is a program, program by Senator Harris. But I mean, it's an important distinction because Senator Harris told her very personal and powerful story, and she was a beneficiary of a voluntary busing program in Berkeley.
Yes, and for those who were advocating for busing as a desegregation measure, he was one of the biggest advocates against it, even enlisting the help of people like the senator from Mississippi.
Who was on the Judiciary Committee that he was also on.
Absolutely.
And I'll say, and people might wonder, well, why?
Why did he just
President Biden is somebody that did not, that didn't believe then, and frankly doesn't believe now, that busing is a cure-all for all the ills that accompany integration and segregation. He didn't believe busing was a cure-all or a silver bullet, for lack of a better term. Okay. And there are many people that believe that. He talked about, at the time, combating redlining. He talked about combating redlining. He talked about making sure that there were good neighborhood schools. He talked about making, fixing the housing issues so that communities were actually integrated in that way, shape, and form. Not, you know, taking a young person and busing them 2 hours out of their community. And so I just think we have to have a humane conversation about this. And
was Kamala's engagement humane? Was it
well,
fair?
I'm not. Who am I? Right?
No, because people, and I know we have to run, but if people in her camp, people allegedly coming out of the Biden camp were saying that she did the work of Donald Trump. And that it was a low blow.
As one of the spokespeople for the vice president's campaign, I can say that that's not official messaging coming out of our campaign, not at all. And as I said this in the spin room that evening after the debate. Who am I to question Senator Harris's story, right? You know, that's a personal story that she told from her vantage point. The vice president respects her, he listened, and he heard her.
He had no problem with that exchange.
Much like how, I'm not saying he didn't have a problem, but like it's her story to tell. So if that's a story you'd like to tell, feel free to tell your story.
Fair point.
Okay? Feel free to tell your story.
Fair point. Symone, thank you. You got to come back.
I will come back. I love you.
I love you too. Black coffee to refill. This is what we do. Thank you.